Are here. I'm glad to see you all. Thank you
Morning.
very much. Today's hearing will focus on President Biden's fiscal year 2022 budget request and his administration priorities for the upcoming year, especially the drought. This hearing is second of two hearings on these topics in order to hear from multiple agencies in this subcommittee's jurisdiction. Let me begin by asking unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit and with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute the microphone prior to speaking and to mute it when finished. To avoid any inadvertent background noise, I request that every member keep the microphone muted when not seeking recognition to speak. Should I hear any inadvertent noise back in the background, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. Today, we will hold our second hearing on the President's fiscal year 22 budget request and other policy goals and objectives of the Biden administration. Let me begin by commending the Biden administration for restoring critical funding and respect for the agencies under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, particularly EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and NOAA, and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Each of the agencies here today play a critical role in management and stewardship of our water resources, whether through regulatory efforts, conservation programs, or treatment and research of water contaminants and impacts on human health. Your work is more important than ever as we face increasing threats from climate change, extreme drought, and emerging pollutants. This budget will help leverage additional funding from the state, local, and nonprofit partners, as well as make federal knowledge and expertise more accessible to communities. Many of the programs provided by your agency assist state and our local governments by providing technical assistance and expert level knowledge for conserving land, managing water systems, mapping sea level rise, and creating easy to use public websites to widely share your data. It is important that these agencies work together and communicate their work effectively. I am very pleased to see that President Biden has proposed to reverse the destructive funding cuts and undo the damaging regulatory rollbacks of the previous administration. Robust funding for these agencies and their programs is important to the delivery of clean water, to understanding the potential health impacts of emerging contaminants, and the conservation and preservation of wetlands and aquatic ecosystems, and the movement of goods and economic competitiveness of our regions. Additionally, across the country, our communities and environment are under unprecedented strain as we deal with the effects of climate change. Much of the West is facing extreme heat and drought. These are dangerous conditions that for humans and our whole planet. I am extremely interested in hearing from these witnesses how we can better manage our resources today and understand and prepare for future needs and challenges. We must take swift action to mitigate ongoing and future harm to all of our environment. Most critically, I fervently hope the administration moves quickly to replace the Trump dirty water rule, which was the greatest undermining of the Clean Water Act in its history. And I urge its complete and immediate repeal. The longer this harmful regulation stays on the books, the more we will forever degrade and destroy our rivers and wetlands. I am also very pleased that the Biden administration has already taken action to make environmental justice a core of every federal agency's mission. For too long, minority and economically disadvantaged communities, the poor communities, have borne a disproportionate share of the burden of industrialization and pollution, and have also been overlooked for necessary public health and environmental investment, a situation even made worse by the impacts of climate change. Addressing this disparity will improve public health, spur economic development in these communities, and create a more equitable society. Today, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on your budget priorities and learning how you are planning to restore your officers to their sworn duties and missions, areas that were so neglected over the past 4 years. I ask unanimous consent to include in the record statement of our chairman DeFacio, and without objection, so ordered. At this time, I am pleased to yield to my colleague, ranking member of subcommittee, Mr. Rouser, for any thoughts he may have. Mr. Rouser, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Napolitano. I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I would also like to thank our witnesses for being here today. As noted, today's hearing will focus on the President's fiscal year 2022 budget proposal for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'd first like to focus my comments on actions involving the EPA. I'm appreciative in fact, very appreciative that we have a high-level representation from the agency's political leadership here at our hearing. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Fox, and congratulations again on your recent Senate confirmation. And I want to share that I certainly very much enjoyed our recent visit. I am, however, growing increasingly concerned that this administration is reversing reasonable policies put in place by the previous administration. Now, I certainly understand that different administrations will have different policy priorities and approaches. That's to be expected. However, it seems as though some of these actions have very little merit, considering most stakeholders have been very happy with the common sense policy clarifications that were made under the Trump administration. A few examples include the reversal of the Clean Water Act Section 401 certification rule and the unprecedented, I might add, mass firing of all members of 2 advisory panels. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but I did make note of it. And then, of course, there's the announced effort underway to rewrite the Trump administration's rule defining waters of the United States, or WOTUS as we call it around here, for purposes of the Clean Water Act. 3 weeks ago, this subcommittee hosted Jamie Pinkham, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and I'll say again today what I said about WOTUS when he was here, as I certainly think that it bears repeating. While not a surprise to hear that the Biden administration is proposing to take this action on WOTUS, it is no less a disappointment. The system we have in place now, in our opinion, works very well. It's fair to our nation's farmers, ranchers, businesses of all types, city planners, etc. A return to anything close to the 2015 WOTUS rule would be a failure, and the regulatory burden placed on average Americans and the effect on the economy would be highly detrimental. As I said when this rewrite was announced, no bureaucrat in Washington should be able to dictate what our farm families, small businesses, local governments, and citizens do on their property after a significant rainfall. So outreach to solicit, truly listen to, and meaningfully address stakeholder concerns is obviously going to be of paramount importance. And so while I certainly appreciated Mr. Pinkham's appearance here, I still have a few questions. After that hearing, in fact, I led a letter to him and to you, Ms. Fox, pointing out the concerns many members of Congress still have on this particular issue. I was joined by 125 of my colleagues here in the House on that letter. Now, I know you believe stakeholder outreach is important, and I think we would all like to hear whatever specifics you may be able to provide regarding that timeline and other details as to how stakeholder engagement will be achieved. On another topic, I would like to highlight an issue very important to me as well as many others in my home state of North Carolina and other states in too, which is PFAS. We need a rational, scientifically informed approach to address this issue, and under the chemical safety laws passed by Congress, this responsibility rests with the EPA. I understand that EPA is actively moving forward with developing important scientific information as part of implementing a PFAS action plan. Implementing this plan and establishing a safe consumption standard is a difficult, time-consuming, and expensive process. I look forward to getting a progress report on these activities and hearing how this is coming along under the guidelines of EPA scientists and chemical safety experts. In addition to the EPA, we also have folks here from 4 other important agencies, as I mentioned before. Between them, these agencies have a diverse set of missions, including maintaining one of North America's most important waterways, helping farmers and ranchers with their conservation needs, protecting our country's coastal zones, and completing the nexus between public health and chemical safety. I look forward to hearing how they complete their objectives and what challenges they face in carrying out those respective duties. Again, thank you to our witnesses. And Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include for the record a copy of the letter that me and 126 other members sent to Michael Regan and Mr. Jamie Pinkham with regard to the WOTUS rule.
So ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. And while I agree on some of the points you made, I think that the dirty water rule also affects people, and that's my biggest concern. So thank you for your testimony, for your opening statement. And now we will proceed from our witness who will testify here today. Thank you all for being here and welcome. On today's panel, we have Assistant Administrator Radhika Fox, Office of Water, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which just was named officially Assistant Administrator. Congratulations, Ms. Radhika Fox. We also have Acting Assistant, Assistant Administrator Nicole LeBoeuf of the National Ocean Service at National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Also, Mr. Terry Cosby, Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, United States Department of Agriculture. Next, we have Dr. Patrick Bracey, Director of Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And our final witnesses, but not the last, Deputy Administrator Craig Middlebrook of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. Without objection, your prepared statements will be entered into the record, and all witnesses are asked to limit their remarks to 5 minutes. Ms. Fox, congratulations again. Welcome, and you may proceed.
So much, Chairman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and members of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment. I'm Radhika Fox, Assistant Administrator for Water at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss EPA's $5.2 billion budget request for our national water program. This FY 2022 budget request supports key areas of investment that will provide safe drinking water and reliable wastewater service to support the environment, protect public health, and power our great US economy. The budget request would give EPA the tools that we need to revitalize our nation's water infrastructure and to support states, tribes, and local partners to achieve our shared goals. I often say, as I'm walking the halls of EPA, this is water's moment. And that's because I truly believe that smart and equitable investment in water is central to addressing the key challenges facing our nation: COVID-19, the need for economic recovery, climate change, and the call for racial justice. And that's why the Biden-Harris administration is moving quickly in our investments in water infrastructure. For example, in the first 100 days of the administration, EPA closed more than $1.3 billion in WIFIA loans in multiple communities. These investments will generate nearly 9,000 jobs and improve water quality for 4 million Americans. Additionally, EPA announced the availability of $2.7 billion for our well-worn, well-run state revolving funds. And what's so exciting is that the president's budget request would really build on these successes, build on this track record. The budget includes $80 million for the WIFIA program, $3.3 billion for the SRF, $600 million in grants that would address the pressing water needs in the diverse communities across America. With these resources, I believe that EPA could make tremendous progress in our mission to protect public health, the environment, reduce exposure to harmful contaminants like lead and PFAS, while also creating jobs and setting the stage for long-term economic development. And the potential benefits to communities could be even greater with the proposed bipartisan infrastructure framework, which proposes a historic $55 billion to enhance EPA's existing and successful water infrastructure programs. For example, this funding could put plumbers and pipe fitters to work, replacing 100% of the nation's lead service lines so that every American can have safe drinking water. I can assure you that the Office of Water will do our work in a way that recognizes that it is low-income people, rural communities, tribal communities, communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted by water-related challenges, whether that's contamination, flooding, affordability, or climate stress. We believe we must do right by these communities, and that is our focus. In terms of tackling the climate crisis, President Biden is taking a whole of government approach, and EPA's Office of Water is proud to be a part of it. We're working closely with our water sector partners to ensure that infrastructure investments keep climate and resilience at the forefront, while also undertaking mitigation efforts that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're doing all of our work in a way to ensure that our regulatory efforts are practical, implementable, durable, and informed by the lived experience of all stakeholders who are impacted by the decisions that we make at the Office of Water. Under Administrator Regan's direction, this is an EPA that is utilizing sound science, following the rule of law, and undertaking rulemaking in close partnership with our state and tribal co-regulators and informed by robust stakeholder engagement. We are truly an EPA that is about partnership and collaboration. For example, none of our shared goals would be possible without strong collaboration between the executive and the legislative branches. And that's why I'm so honored to join you today. Once again, Chairman Napolitano and Ranking Member Rouser and members of the subcommittee, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. And I very much look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fox. That was tremendous. Mr. LaBeouf, you're next. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to testify today. I am Nicole LaBeouf, NOAA's Assistant Administrator for Ocean Services and Coastal Zone Management. My statement will offer highlights of NOAA's fiscal year 2022 proposed budget, illustrating that investing in NOAA is more important than ever before as we turn our attention to the threat of climate change. NOAA's ability to understand and predict our changing planet is essential to communities around the country that are impacted by extreme events like hurricanes, floods, droughts, and wildfires, as well as the chronic impacts of heat waves and sea level rise. In 2020 alone, there were 22 environmental disasters in the United States, each with economic losses exceeding $1 billion. So it is fitting that a subcommittee that resides within the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is requesting today's hearing. NOAA's climate data, tools, and services are fundamental to sustaining our nation's transportation, military, supply chain, and other built infrastructure essential to our economic prosperity and our very way of life. From the depths of the ocean to the surface of the sun, NOAA's mission not just to understand our Earth systems, but to deliver services and decision support makes NOAA uniquely capable of helping our nation build infrastructure that's resilient to the impacts of a changing climate. From safeguarding our coastal military installations from the effects of sea level rise and utilizing nature-based infrastructure in highway planning to assisting emergency responders to create more disaster resilience communities, the American people need NOAA's data and tools more than ever. Beyond infrastructure, NOAA is being increasingly called upon by private industry and the public to provide a wide range of fundamental climate services and decision support. Through investments in research, observations and forecasting, restoration and resilience, and equitable delivery of services, in FY22, NOAA will deliver new and improved climate tools, products, and services to decision makers, communities, businesses, and the public. In FY22, NOAA requests $1.5 billion over FY21 enacted levels, over half of which, $855 million, to specifically expand climate research, support regional and local decision-making, and help the most vulnerable communities prepare for climate change. NOAA is requesting an increase of $149.3 million to improve our understanding of climate change on timescales from weeks to several decades, enhancing our ability to predict precipitation, drought, and the impacts of climate change on fisheries, farms, protected species, and other living marine resources. In FY22, NOAA requests includes an increase of $368.2 million to upgrade our ocean and coastal observing systems and to better integrate NOAA's marine navigation, weather, and environmental information into public and private sector decision-making. Building on our world-class weather predictions, NOAA proposes to build a seasonal forecast system to better inform regional and local adaptation and planning for nature-based infrastructure, food production, finance, and national security. NOAA seeks to improve short-term forecasts to include fire weather prediction and longer-term modeling of climate variability to better understand the interrelatedness between wildfires, weather, and climate change. Along the coasts and in the ocean, where conditions are changing rapidly, NOAA proposes to enhance core services such as measuring sea level rise to help decision makers safeguard the well-being of coastal communities. NOAA seeks to expand long-standing programs like the National Sea Grant College Program and NOAA's Coastal Zone Management Program to help local communities by empowering NOAA's partners with on-the-ground expertise. NOAA is requesting an increase of $259.3 million for ecological restoration and community resilience, including through research on blue carbon sequestration in places that provide fish habitat, storm and erosion protection, and water quality improvements. Investments in the National Marine Sanctuaries and the National Estuarine Research Reserve Systems, as well as the National Coastal Resilience Fund, will engage communities, provide employment, and generate a wide array of economic and climate resilience co-benefits. In pursuit of climate solutions and economic prosperity, NOAA proposes an increase of $20.4 million to support offshore wind development so that Americans may expand clean energy usage while protecting marine resources, fisheries, and other important ocean activities. And NOAA is requesting $57.9 million to improve our equitable delivery of climate services to help vulnerable communities prepare for extreme weather and climate disasters. Measuring and predicting climate change impacts are core to NOAA's mission, as is delivering climate solutions to all Americans. We welcome the opportunity to work with you so that NOAA's delivery of climate science and services may be more fully deployed to meet the needs of our nation in preparing for the impacts of climate change. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. LeBeouf. I'm terribly sorry I said Miss. Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Cosby, you may proceed. You have to unmute yourself, sir.
Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Rouser and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation and Watershed Program. NRCS delivers voluntary programs and services that enable producers, agricultural landowners, tribal nations, and others to enhance their land stewardship activities, improving the viability of agricultural operations and the sustainability of the nation's soils, water, and related natural resources in non-federal lands. About 70% of the nation's land is privately owned, making stewardship by private landowners and managers critical to the health of our agricultural lands and economies. NRCS provides science-based technical assistance to help our customers better manage the natural resources of their land. Financial assistance help offset the cost to install conservation practices that sustain and enhance natural resources and habitats. Although we administer a wide range of conservation programs, today I will focus on the NRCS watershed programs. NRCS watershed programs include the Small Watershed Program, the Watershed Operations Program, and the Watershed Rehabilitation Program. Through these programs, NRCS collaborates with state and local agencies, tribal governments, and other federal agencies to prevent damage caused by erosion, floodwater, and sediment. The vast majority of NRCS watershed projects have been built pursuant to the Small Watershed Program Authority, PL 566 projects, under which NRCS works with local government sponsors and individual landowners to solve natural resources and related economic problems within watersheds. These projects protect our communities, infrastructure, and natural resources through flood prevention and damage reduction, development of rural water supplies, erosion and sediment control, fish and wildlife habitat enhancement, and wetland creation and restoration. To date, NRCS has assisted in construction of 11,800 watershed dams and other work of improvements to mitigate flooding downstream, enhance municipal and industrial water supplies, provide recreational opportunities, and improve irrigation water sources for our farmers and ranchers. These watershed projects help protect more than 180,000 farms, 610,000 businesses, and positively impact more than 48 million people each day. In 2020, the agency received $175 million in discretionary funding and $50 million in mandatory funding. Using these funds, NRCS provided funding to 41 new and 12 backlog projects in 24 states. NRCS provides technical assistance and cost sharing for constructions. Local sponsors assume responsibility for the operations and maintenance of structures once completed. The Watershed Rehabilitation Program provides assistance with the planning, design, and implementation needed to rehab aging watershed dams. We prioritize dams that pose the greatest risk to public safety. Our efforts can extend the service of life of dams, bring them into compliance with applicable safety and performance standards, or begin steps to decommission dams that pose a threat to life and property. In fiscal year 2020, the Watershed Rehabilitation Program received $10 million in discretionary funding and $19.9 million in mandatory funding, which helps repair aging infrastructures, creates jobs and commerce, and protects homes and families. NRCS continues to provide funding and promotes assessments of high hazard potential dams, monitor costs, and examine the rehabilitation program to ensure equity, delivery in economically disadvantaged areas. We utilize $1.1 million to fund 50 dam assessments. These assessments provide communities with technical information about the condition of their dam and alternatives for rehabilitation of dams that do not currently meet federal dam safety standards. By December 2021, 5,948 watershed dams will have reached the end of their original design lifespan. This happens over time because dam spillways pipes can deteriorate, reservoirs may fill with sediment, and mainly formerly agricultural land are now covered by urban sprawl. A dam failure could pose a serious threat to the health and safety of those living downstream and to the communities that depend on a reservoir. Dam failure also brings serious adverse environmental impacts. The fiscal 22 president budget proposed discretionary apportionment of $110 million to small watershed programs, $65 million for flood prevention operation program, and $10 million for the watershed rehabilitation program. It also includes a legislative proposal for mandatory appropriation to increase funding for the watershed and flood prevention operation to $100 million per year. In closing, NRCS watershed operations provides critical infrastructures as we face ongoing extreme weather and natural disasters. Farmers, ranchers, foresters, and other landowners are on the front lines of the climate crisis. NRCS stands ready to support these and stewards with infrastructure solutions that respond to the severity of the crisis. I appreciate Congress' continued support for NRCS and our work to ensure the safety and viability of our small watershed and voluntary conservation on working land. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. And now we may proceed to Dr. Pricey. You may proceed, sir.
Chairman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss how investment in the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, also known as ATSGR, are working to protect Americans' health now and in the future. ATSGR protects communities from harmful effects of exposure to hazardous agents by supporting and building capacity at state, tribal, territorial, and local health departments, by monitoring and investigating environmental exposures in communities, by preparing for and responding to emergencies, and by developing critical science-based tools and resources. While ATSGR is uniquely positioned to examine the health impacts of environmental exposures, demand for ATSGR's technical and scientific support exceeds the current capacity of the agency to respond. Over the past 10 years, ATSGR has seen its purchasing power eroded by relatively flat funding levels despite increasing demand for our support. Modest increases in funding in FY20 and FY21, along with the supplemental COVID-19 funding, have allowed ATSDR to provide marginal enhancements in its support to state and local health departments, to expand its environmental health education activities, to investigate the health impacts of exposure to emerging contaminants, and to develop tools to address environmental risks and aid in emergency response. The FY22 President's budget looks to continue this progress by requesting an additional $3.75 million to expand geospatial public health analysis activities, which will increase our environmental public health capacity. In FY20, ATSDR awarded approximately $35 million to 28 health departments through its cooperative agreement program. 5 applicants were approved, but unfunded due to funding constraints. ATSDR also manages a national network of pediatric environmental health specialty units to advise parents and healthcare providers on protecting and caring for children potentially exposed to harmful chemicals. Supplemental COVID-19 funding to these units and to 16 states' cooperative agreement partners allowed them to provide information on safe practices for disinfection of homes and education facilities during the COVID-19 response. ATSDR and its funded health grantees are investigating exposure to and possible health effects associated with emerging contaminants, such as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS, and ethylene oxide. ATSDR is conducting PFAS exposure assessments in 10 communities near current or former military bases, and is conducting a groundbreaking PFAS health study at 8 sites across the country. ATSDR is also working with pediatric environmental health specialty units and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to provide clinicians with resources they need to best serve their patients with exposure to PFAS concerns. ATSDR is supporting several states to address ethylene oxide exposures near medical device sterilization facilities, including working in 5 communities near these facilities. ATSDR is simultaneously exploring opportunities to study ethylene oxide exposure on the national scale. ATSDR staff and geospatial program continue to provide support for 90 sites across the U.S. that are experiencing environmental health concerns. Additionally, the geospatial program developed the COVID data tracker dashboard, addressing data needs for the COVID-19 response. This one-stop source for COVID-19 data allows health professionals to increase their understanding of the novel coronavirus, to reduce the disproportionate burden of the pandemic on communities of color and other groups that have been marginalized, and to explore the impact of recovery on healthcare systems. ATSDR's geospatial team is currently working on an environmental justice index that will use to identify communities that experience disproportionately high environmental burdens in the U.S. ATSDR has a unique mission and responsibility to advance health through the conduction of studies, through the use of innovative data sources, through support for local health departments, the development of guidance for clinicians, and through direct interaction with communities affected by exposure to hazardous substances. In FY22, we will continue working toward our goal of providing science-based evidence to inform actions that protect people from environmental exposures and to improve their health. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and to discuss the important work of ATSDR.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony, and we will proceed with Mr. Middlebrook. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Rouser, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you today and present the President's fiscal 2022 budget request for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. I'm happy to share this information with you and to report on the activities of the corporation. More than 3 billion metric tons of cargo valued at over $450 billion has transited the St. Lawrence Seaway over its 60-plus year history. This includes grain, iron ore, steel, project cargoes, and other bulk commodities. During the 2020 navigation season, nearly 38 million metric tons of cargo moved through the binational waterway. The St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation was renamed the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation by Congress as part of the fiscal year 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act. This name change was led by your colleagues to acknowledge the Seaway's longstanding contributions and importance to the Great Lakes region and its economy. Since then, we have been executing this name change, and on May 13th of this year, the 67th anniversary of our creation by Congress, we debuted our new corporate seal. For fiscal year 2022, the President's budget requests an appropriation of $37.7 million from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. The budget request includes two programs: Seaway Operations and Maintenance and Seaway Infrastructure. This request supports the administration's priorities of safety, job creation and economic growth, and transformational infrastructure investments. The fiscal year 2022 request for the Seaway Operations and Maintenance Program is $23.2 million. This will provide the financial and personnel resources necessary to perform the operational, maintenance, and administrative functions of the corporation, including lock operations, marine services, vessel traffic control, asset maintenance, ballast water management, safety and environmental inspections, and trade promotion and economic development. Operations and maintenance also includes a request of $1.5 million for the U.S. portion of the operations and maintenance costs of the binational Seaway International Bridge. The U.S. and Canada share the ownership, management, and operation of this international bridge. Due to COVID-19 and the cross-border travel restrictions, paid car and truck traffic on the bridge has dramatically decreased to only 10 to 15% of average levels. That has resulted in a 70 to 75% reduction in toll revenue, and as a result, the bridge is unable to function self-sufficiently. Last year, the Canadian government provided federal funding to supplement the reduced tolls to ensure the bridge safely remains open. The $1.5 million request in the fiscal year 2022 budget request will satisfy the U.S.'s shared commitment to the needs of the bridge. The budget request for the Seaway Infrastructure Program includes $14.5 million for 11 maritime infrastructure-related capital projects, including $6.5 million for the rehabilitation of the diffusers at Snell Lock, used to dampen the flow of water when the lock is emptied, $3 million to replace deteriorated and damaged concrete at Eisenhower Lock and Snell Lock, $1.5 million to upgrade electrical distribution equipment at the locks and maintenance facilities, and $1 million to upgrade the machine shop facility used to maintain the new hands-free mooring technology at the locks. I'm happy to report that we were able to operate during the 2020 navigation season without any positive cases of COVID-19 impacting our workforce, even though the majority of our Messina, New York-based operational employees reported to the worksite every day, given our operational nature. During the winter maintenance cycle, our workforce was impacted by several positive cases. However, additional remedial measures implemented quickly reduced the transmission of COVID-19, and the winter maintenance schedule was completed in time for the opening of the 2021 navigation season on March 22nd. The fiscal year 2022 budget request will help ensure that the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation can continue to operate and maintain the U.S. seaway infrastructure, ensure safe navigation, protect the environment, and promote trade and economic development. Thank you for including my written statement in the record, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Middlebrook. Thank you to all our witnesses, and we will now move to have the questions from the witness to the witnesses, and we'll use the timer to allow 5 minutes of questions for each member. If there are additional questions, we may have additional rounds as necessary. In beginning the questioning to Ms. Fox, in many places in the West, including my district, we're taking vital steps to fight drought by improving local water capture and groundwater recharge. Many groundwater basins that would be very effective for water storage and supply have had major challenges with the historical contamination. Some of the sites are Superfund, some are brownfields, and some are regulated by the Resources Conservation and Recovery Act. What is EPA doing to specifically address groundwater remediation for basins needed for water supply, especially in drought-prone regions?
Thank you so much for the question, Chairwoman Napolitano, and I share your deep concern for the drought that is plaguing the Western states. In fact, we now have 99% of the West in drought. That's 14 states, including my California, where we are both from, and 60% of the West is now in extreme drought. So, you know, the EPA is doing several things to really address this issue. For example, the EPA's Office of Water and the Office of Land and Emergency Management are working together on cleaning up groundwater and building long-term drought resiliency. We're also actively engaged in the White House Drought Working Group, which is led by Department of Interior and USDA to really think about in the short term, in this crisis that we're seeing in the West, what can we do? What short-term funding options do we have to support communities? We're also actively engaged in the National Drought Resilience Partnership, which is really looking at longer-term authorities. And what I would say, Congresswoman Napolitano, as far as the tools and resources we have available to tackle drought, one of the biggest ones that we have at EPA is really the work that we are doing around water reuse. We have a dedicated water reuse team here in the Office of Water, and they're really working with communities all around the country to make sure that they know what the latest technologies are, providing technical assistance and support, trying to coordinate across the federal family on water reuse and recycling. We're also really thinking about how to target the funding and financing programs that we have available to this issue. So for example, states can utilize their drinking water revolving loan fund programs for aquifer recharge projects. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is with this year's Notice of Funding Availability for WIFIA, we're prioritizing projects that tackle these kinds of issues and tackle climate resilience. It really is going to take all of us working together to make sure that the urgent crisis around drought is addressed. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, ma'am, for the answer. I have a great concern for the protection of the Clean Water Act and trouble that the administration is not addressed dirty water rule. And your testimony today doesn't even mention it. Particular concern of many of the streams that feed the great rivers of the arid West only flow in the rainy season and are dry the rest of the year. These are rivers that we rely on for our drinking water, and if they are polluted because of lack of protection for intermittent waters, our residents and businesses will be forced to pay for treatment of contaminated water sources. What is EPA doing to protect and prevent pollution in these areas?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and I share your concerns about the navigable waters protection rule and the lack of protections that we have for so many water bodies across America. That's why Army and EPA have made the determination to undertake a rulemaking to address these issues. As Administrator Regan and I have said, we want to develop a definition of waters of the United States that's consistent with the spirit and intent of the Clean Water Act, which is to preserve and protect the integrity of our nation's waters. And we also want a rule that stops the ping pong, Congresswoman. I mean, for over a decade, we've had multiple lawsuits. It seems like every time there's an election, this rule gets rewritten, and we want to stop that ping pong because at the end of the day, who gets hurt? It's people, and it's our nation's waters. And that's why we are both going to be expeditious as we develop this rulemaking, but we're going to do it in a way that is grounded in learning from the lessons of the past. We're going to understand what worked and what didn't about the pre-2015 WOTUS definition, what worked and what didn't around the Clean Water Rule, and then also what worked and what doesn't about the Navigable Waters Rule.
Thank you very much for your answers, ma'am. I appreciate it. Mr. Rouser, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. Fox, thank you again for being here. It's great to see you. And thank you again for the visit that we had recently. I very much enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you. Number of things, but I'm going to start with this. So a few weeks ago, as I mentioned in my testimony, or pardon me, my opening comments rather, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, Jamie Pinkham, testified before this subcommittee. And he, in essence, said this, or I asked him this question, which agency is going to be the lead on the WOTUS rewrite? And his response was, quote, "It will be primarily EPA with a tremendous amount of engagement from the Civil Works program at the Army." Would you say that's an accurate assessment? Is that how you understand the relationship there?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to see you again, Congressman Rouser, and I really enjoyed our discussion about so many water quality issues in North Carolina, and really look forward to working with you as I take on this new role. So the Waters of the United States is a joint rulemaking between that with EPA and Army both having a responsibility. And so, it is a big and important rule. And so we divide up the work and we're very collaborative. We actually have bi-weekly meetings. At the staff level, they meet weekly on many of the technical issues. It's really a collaboration in the finest sense of the word between our two agencies.
Which agency, or is it both of you, that will be coordinating the stakeholder outreach? And can you give a timeline on that? Any specific details on what that will entail?
Yes, we have not ironed out the specific sort of staffing division of responsibility on the stakeholder engagements, but I do anticipate that EPA Office of Water staff will, take on a lot of the administrative coordination, logistical coordination, et cetera, of those stakeholder engagements. As to your question, Congressman, about the timing, we want to be as transparent in the development of this role, because we know it's so foundational to so many things that communities care about. And so later this summer, we will be announcing the framework for the rulemaking and also the various stakeholder engagements that will happen. But just to preview that for you, sir, later this summer, we intend to do public listening sessions that will be virtual. So any member of the general public can share their feedback with EPA and Army. We will also do dedicated stakeholder conversations with many of the stakeholder groups that are impacted with that rule. We will meet with agriculture, we will meet with industry, we'll meet with environmental organizations, environmental justice groups, and of course, our state and tribal co-regulators, local government, and county governments are so important to this. So we will do those, targeted stakeholder discussions. And then we anticipate in the late fall, early winter, we will then have regional roundtables as well. And really the regional roundtables, Congressman, are intended to are really recognize that the way in which Waters of the U.S. Is implemented in different regions, it looks different because the geology, the hydrology are different. And so we really need to understand that application, that implementation on the ground. And so we'll be doing those really in all of the 10 EPA regions, and like I said, in the late winter.
One quick question, and this is very important. I remember in 2015, the Obama Waters of the U.S. rule. I had Democrat mayors, Republican mayors. It was across the board, just a lot of strong concern. There were 31 states and a myriad of stakeholder groups representing farmers, ranchers, miners, really anyone who wanted to do anything on land were very much concerned about the rule. Who is concerned about the Trump rule specifically? I know my friends on the other side call it the dirty water rule, but I've not heard a word from my Democrat mayors back home or anyone. People seem to be satisfied with this rule. So I'm just wondering who you all have specifically heard from.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for that feedback about the concerns from your constituents on the 2015 rule. Of course, as you know, I was not here in 2015, so I can't speak to all the particulars. But what I can say is that with the navigable waters protection rule, it is being litigated in many courts around the country. In fact, there are 20 states' attorneys that have expressed their deep concern. And I will say, I think that concern, there is cause for concern in thinking about some of the long-term water quality protections. If, we have heard, for example, from New Mexico that now over 90% of their waters are no longer jurisdictional. And what the concern that they have raised to us is that when a water is not jurisdictional, it means that we don't have the ability to use the permitting process to assess and potentially mitigate water quality impacts. We're not saying no development. We're saying, we want to really understand the impacts of a particular development on our nation's waters. And that's really why this definition is so important. So we have heard lots of concerns about the 2020 rule. We've heard lots of concerns about the 2015 rule. And Congressman, that is why Administrator Regan, Army, myself are so committed to really understanding those implementation challenges through our stakeholder engagement process and really trying to find a balance that really protects our waters and but is also clear and efficient in its implementation.
Madam Chair,
Mr.
my
Russell, your
time's
time is
expired.
up,
Thank
sir.
you.
You're very welcome. I would like to have Mr. Johnson next, Ms. Johnson, followed by Mr. Webster, followed by Mr. Garamendi, Mr. Bost. Ms. Johnson, you're on.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having this hearing. I'd like to pose a question first to Ms. Fox. I was pleased to see in your testimony that the EPA, under the leadership of Administrator Regan, is embedding equity in everything that it does. I'm wondering specifically, what are the primary avenues in which the agency intends to embark upon this goal? And how do you see the EPA accomplishing this? And what do you view as the main obstacles or roadblocks that may be in place that you need to overcome?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and it's wonderful to see you again. It's been, I think, almost a number of years since we've last visited. So thank you for the question. And I have to say, our commitment to equity starts from President Biden and to Administrator Regan. And what Administrator Regan has done is he has asked each of his national program offices and our 10 EPA regions to look at what regulatory authority, what funding and financing programs we have, what voluntary programs we have. You know, we also have a range of technical assistance tools available to us, and to really has asked us to assess, you know, are there disproportionate impacts from how we are utilizing these authorities that we have, and can we do better? So what that means in the context of the Office of Water is we're looking at things like, you know, when we do a rulemaking, do we have meaningful community engagement from those who are perhaps disproportionately impacted? And unfortunately, we haven't always done that. And that's why, for example, as we're looking at the lead and copper rule, we are doing community roundtables with low-income people and communities of color around the country. So we're thinking about, are we being equitable when we do these regulations and rulemaking? We're also, I'm very grateful that Congress has bestowed upon the Office of Water a range of funding and financing programs. Have we, you know, are those resources going to communities who are most vulnerable when it comes to water quality and quantity challenges? So we're doing that assessment. And then, Congressman, you know, one of the things that I would say, as far as do we have all the tools that we need, I would say I think we need more. So, for example, one of the barriers that we face in utilizing some of our grant programs is that the definition of disadvantaged communities doesn't always line up, or doesn't always actually target the communities who are most vulnerable. So we may need to come to Congress and present that information to all of you so that we could work on getting those things aligned. You know, another thing that I hear from communities all around the country is that they need technical assistance and support to even be able to access the funds that they have, that we have. And so we think that it's actually really important to invest more in building the technical and the managerial and the financial capacity of these more vulnerable water systems. And so I think that's another area of promise as we move forward. And then, of course, you know, the environmental justice programs, the president's budget, the FY 2022 budget calls for a historic investment in environmental justice communities. And so we are keeping our fingers crossed that makes it into the final budget that Congress passes, because we know that the situation is dire all around the country.
Well, thank you very much. I just have a very short amount of time. I'll yield back. I don't have this. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Webster, you're next. You're on.
Am I on?
Yes,
Can
you
hear
are.
me?
Yes,
Great.
sir.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Cosby. in the agricultural world, does your area, because we've been talking about global warming and so forth, do you have any impact on the agriculture industry and their harvesting and planting machines and so forth as it comes to internal combustion engines? Do you have anything to do with that?
And thank you for the question, sir. And my agency is, we have a lot of things that we do. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the programs that we have to offer to the landowners across this great country through our conservation programs and through our working lands programs. And it helps these farmers adjust to a lot of things that are happening. And especially with drought and some of the disasters that are happening around the country right now. We have our EQIP program, our environmental equip program that we help, and we administer that throughout the whole country. And we offer those programs to the farmers out there, and it helps them to address a lot of things. What we do on the land is we sit down with the landowner and we start with a conservation plan. And from that conservation plan, we talk to the landowner about, what are their objectives? What are you trying to achieve on these acres? We walk, a lot of times we walk every acre and we talk about what the resource needs are for those acres. And we help inform landowners on what they can do to solve some of those resource problems. And a lot of times those landowners take those plans, they implement those programs, but also we have our financial assistance programs that we offer to allow the landowners to help offset some of the costs of some of these practices that they want to put on. A lot of our practices, they do a lot for climate mitigation, and it helps with erosion, water quality. And so we have a lot of tools in the toolbox to work with landowners around the country to help them with their resource needs, sir.
Specifically, let me ask, most of the harvesting and so forth, there's a museum in my area for international harvester equipment and kinds of interesting pieces of equipment, and they're still used to, and they're all internal combustion engines. And I'm wondering, is there a battery powered industry building or coming or thought about in the agriculture industry? Do you know?
So what I would like to do is take that question back with me and maybe sit down with you and your staff to look at this a little bit further. But I'd like to take that question back.
Okay, well, I got a lot of agriculture in my area, and I'm not sure exactly how they're going. One of the things I'm talking about is the fact that in Florida, if you had an electric vehicle, you wouldn't want to leave the state trying to get out of the state with a hurricane coming with that electric vehicle. In some places, you can't make it, and then to recharge it's going to be a little difficult. But in the area of farming, the recharging stations are not next to you; they're not there. And I'm wondering if that industry is kind of part of what you take back with you, and part of what I'd like to know about is what's happening in that realm of the agriculture that changes footprint, changes the use of internal combustion engines, and allows for farmers still to maintain what they're doing, still to do their work, still to crops, still feed us, but yet do it in a way that would be the right way. And anyway, I'll look forward to hearing back from you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster, for yielding back. Mr. McGurman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for the witnesses, thank you very much for your statements. I've got about a dozen questions for each of you, and certainly not the time to ask them. Ms. Fox, you have been questioned several times on the waters of the U.S. I will add very briefly to that. It's an extremely important issue for California, particularly for my district, where I have about 200 miles of the Sacramento River Valley and a lot of agriculture. The 2015 rule created very, very serious problems for agriculture, where a drainage ditch, dry most of the year, would be subject to the rule. The Trump rule went too far in the other direction. There's a lot of middle ground there. Listening to the way in which you intend to go about that, it's the right way. Gather the information, find the appropriate way to deal with it. Not every agricultural ditch is a water of the US or would have impact. Also, please keep in mind that there are other federal rules that also interact with waters of the US, particularly the clean water programs, discharges and the like. And so when you explained what you wanted to do and your philosophy, I think you may have merged into the discharge area. In any case, count on us being deeply involved in all of this. Our pharmacist will be there and I'll be there. I did oppose the 2015, much to the chagrin of my environmental friends, but I thought it was too far, too much. And of course, the Trump administration will equally too far in the other direction. I'm going to let it go at that. You've already opined on this and we'll deeply be involved in it. I do have a couple of other questions. Mr. Crosby, not a question, but a shout out and a thank you. The NRCS is extremely important in California. The work that you're doing, not only on the farms, but now into the forest, working with, for example, the Yuba County Water Agency, trying to figure out how to bring NRCS into the forest for forest health, for water, as well as for fire protection. Please continue, be strong, make sure that money goes out to the projects, most of which you've already spoke to. I had not expected to talk about the Toxic Substance and Disease Registration Program, Mr. Breezy, but I'm going to. My work in the House Armed Services Committee is directly related and complementary to what you're doing. And so I would appreciate a conversation with you and my staff about the work that you're doing on this. The registry program that you're talking about, we have a similar program with the military, the Oath Act, and then augmenting that this year to cover many of the things that you're covering. So we've got a meeting that will be scheduled between your team and our team on the House Armed Services Committee. With regard to the Great Lakes, we are putting together an amendment to the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Prevention and Control Act of 1990 so that we can find a way of making sure that boats and ships that move from one environment to another do not transmit aquatic, non-native aquatic species. So we look forward to working with you, Mr. Middlebrook, that on this issue so that we can once again try to protect our native aquatic species from invasives. So yeah, you and I and our team are going to have a further conversation. And finally, with regard to the NOAA, you have icebreakers. You rent icebreakers. I want to know how you are doing that. I want to know how that works. The Coast Guard and the Navy are in desperate need of icebreakers. Maybe your model works, maybe it doesn't. So let's look at that and have a conversation about it. So my questions are, hey, we're going to have a conversation on each and every one of these issues. What do you say to that? On board? Thumbs up? Let's do it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi, very much for your input. Next, we have Mr. Boast. You're on, you may proceed. Mr. Boast? We will proceed to the next individual, Mr. Pappas.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity.
I'm sorry, wait, I'm sorry, I skipped somebody. I'm sorry, Mr. Pappas. It's Mr. Malinowski's next.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Very interesting and important testimony. And I wanted to start with you, Ms. Fox, raising an issue about cybersecurity. Earlier this year, as you know, a water treatment plant in Oldmar, Florida was hacked, and the intruders apparently attempted to dramatically increase the amount of lye in the water treatment process. It was a near miss that could have been absolutely catastrophic. This is obviously a larger problem. Chris Krebs, the former director of CISA, speaking to this event, said that the vulnerability at that particular water treatment plant was probably more the rule than the exception around the United States. I note that EPA has asked for a small increase to $15 million in its budget to help these kinds of facilities harden their systems. So I wonder, first of all, do you agree with Mr. Krebs that was more the rule than the exception? And second, say a little bit about what the money you're requesting will do and whether it's sufficient.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And one thing that you may or may not know about me is that I used to work for a local water utility. I worked for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And so I saw firsthand working at a local water utility how vulnerable water utilities are. So you mentioned the situation in Florida, but we have seen cyber threats, cyber attacks on other water utilities around the country. This is a critical issue when it relates to preserving public health. So this is an area, I think what is in the FY 2022 budget is a start, but we are going to need, I think, more tools and resources in order to make sure that our drinking water and wastewater systems are cyber secure. We have, I think, made some really good progress in a voluntary way, working with the federal family, and then working with some of the national water associations, working with the associations that represent our state co-regulators. But I think we need to invest more in these water utilities so that they can develop cybersecurity plans. I think we need to start asking whether when a breach happens, is there a requirement that it's reported to the EPA? Because that's currently not the case. So I think that there's a lot that we need to do from a regulatory perspective and from a funding perspective. And I would welcome the opportunity to work with you and this committee on moving some of those issues forward.
Thank you. Would that require legislation or is that a regulatory fix?
So I think one thing that we are doing within the Office of Water is really at the request of the National Security Council and the President is what current regulatory authorities do we have that we could utilize to do more on cyber. But we also know that we are going to need, I think, more legislative action in order to.
And then in terms of specifically the reporting requirement.
The reporting as well as funding directly so that water utilities can make these kinds of investments.
Good, thank you. And then finally, just to echo the emphasis that Ms. LeBeouf provided on climate and climate policy. I mean, we had a record-breaking year in 2020 in terms of the number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in this country. 22. The previous record was 16, and we've seen the heat waves and what happened in Texas and subways flooded in New York City. And you know, I guess my quick question for you is there any amount of money we can spend on resiliency and hardening infrastructure that's actually going to insulate us from those kinds of disasters if we don't take dramatic action soon to actually deal with the cause of those disasters, which is the change in climate?
It's an excellent question, Congressman. And, you know, I think this question is exactly why President Biden is acting so urgently to address the climate crisis. We have had a number of executive orders that I think illustrate the urgency with which the president wants us to act. The National Climate Office within the White House is doing an excellent job of convening the federal family on these issues. And it's why I think we so desperately need the bipartisan infrastructure framework to become legislation, it would really help us make a lot of progress on the climate issue as well.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Now we will proceed to Mr. Lamalfa, followed by Mr. Mace, and then Mr. Papas. You're on, Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. You know, as we sit here in the West and Northern California, I have at least 7 forest fires going on in my area here. And what we don't hear talked about enough, we hear a lot about, you know, changing weather patterns, but not a lot about the action in order to mitigate drought and to mitigate forests that have an overload, have an over inventory of trees and brush and dead material that needs to be removed and made something useful of it. So if we want to do something about this situation with changing weather patterns, why don't we focus on thinning forests, manage them in a way so they have the inventory per acre that makes them much more survivable, and storing more water when we do get it as rainfall. We're getting less of snowpack lately, and we would have that to carry over into later years. But you know, those are the eternal discussions that we have and seem to gloss over a lot. And you know, so regards to the WOTUS conversation earlier here, we've had areas up here where people in agriculture have been told they cannot farm their land because it somehow affects the waters of the United States. Changing crops, changing from a grain crop to a tree crop, has in recent times, you know, before the Trump administration WOTUS action, people were getting fined and getting land even seized from them for changing crops and forming their land in a way that works for actually better water management for them. And so it really became an out of control rule. And as one of my colleagues was mentioning, who's complaining right now about WOTUS as it is, as it's been redefined. So when we do the ping pong thing back and forth, we want to change it back to the thing that was very, very restrictive. Waters of the United States has nothing to do with farmers' irrigation ditch, drainage ditch, the land on which they're farming themselves. When you want to talk rivers and things like that, fine, you have a conversation. But every drop of water that falls on somebody's roof, somebody's driveway, somebody's ditch, somebody's field does not belong to the United States. And that is something that needs to be made clear and understood by this administration and everybody else in Washington, D.C. So with those struggles we have in agriculture, I want to focus on Chief Cosby there. You mentioned in your issues with NRCS, you want to protect the viability of agriculture operations, the nation's soil, water, and related natural resources on non-federal lands. So let me bring up how things are going in the Klamath Basin, which borders Northern California and Southern Oregon, the Klamath Lake there. It, of course, is facing a catastrophic lack of water supply. The lack of water is partially the federal government's fault. The Klamath Project was built, part of it over 100 years ago, to bring water to agriculture that belongs solely to agriculture. Courts have upheld that water, the augmentation of the existing lake, was water that belongs to agriculture. Yet it's still being pilfered by Department of Interior through Bureau of Reclamation to flush down the stream for either trying to help coho salmon or being forced to stay in the lake, ostensibly to try and help the suckerfish. So both ESA and the NEPA both require that the water be flushed for those reasons. So it's really a conundrum as to which way do you keep the water in the lake, do you flush it out? Either way, none of it is now available for agriculture or the refuges up there where much wildlife that affects the whole Pacific Flyway is in place. So the Bureau this year, Bureau of Electricity, for the first time ever, will not even open the canal to agriculture to send in for irrigation water for products that you and I use all across this country. So it triggers a long process of government aid approval that would actually be helpful, but it takes months and months. Meanwhile, those folks are on the line with not being able to farm their crops and make a living for like that. So they'll be waiting for Congress to put together a disaster package. The Bureau has already allocated its entire aid budget. So question to you, Mr. Cosby, is with the goals you lay out for your agency to protect the viability of agricultural operations, we want farming the basin to continue, but we have to set up a much faster process to get the aid out. These farmers don't want aid. They'd rather farm with the water that actually belongs to them. That said, what can we do to speed up the process to get the aid out so they can get through 2021? We believe the Commodity Credit Corporation is a vehicle we can do that with, partnering with NRCS. CCC does much work already with agriculture, as you know. And so they could be a way for a distribution system for payments, not completely unlike how we tasked SBA to get through the CARES Act and the first part of the COVID business. So what do you think about the partnership that the NRCS can use with CCC to accelerate aid payments for these farmers and ranchers that are up in that basin?
And Congressman, thank you for your question. And you know, we share your concern about drought and what's happening in the western part of the United States. And NRCS is making some programs available to those farmers and ranchers. It's mainly through our Environmental Quality Incentive Program, which we call EQIP. We've made available.
Sir, let me jump in there. We've heard of EQIP.
Your time is up, Lamalfa.
It's a fine program. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a fine program, but it doesn't do anything near the scale of what we're talking about for the type of damage that's being done up there. And so when you say we have programs, they're good little programs, but they nip at the edges of the size of an agricultural operation. I'm a farmer in my real life too, and they help with some small
putting
things.
them in writing, Mr. Lamalfa?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we may proceed to the next member of Congress, Ms. Mace. You're on.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Rouser. Appreciate the time this afternoon. And I appreciate all of our witnesses being here today, and especially you, Ms. LaBeouf with NOAA. I'm speaking to you today from historic Charleston's historic battery right here in downtown Charleston. And also behind me, right on the water, and actually a little bit further behind me, we began that way, is the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, where NOAA also has a lab and works with our department here. And while we're not always going to see eye to eye on funding priorities, I know there are some areas where I think we can join together and work together with all of my colleagues here today. And I want to echo how important the work that NOAA does, your organization, in regards to flooding, which is why I'm standing in downtown Charleston this afternoon. 40 years ago, flooding in Charleston, where I'm standing today, averaged about 2 times a year. Today, in 2021, 40 years later, we're seeing over 40 flood incidences of flooding every single year. And it is predicted by 2045, our city is predicted to be hit by coastal flooding up to 180 times per year. Additionally, our region has been hit by several major flooding events over the years, including the 1,000-year flood, which was in October of 2015, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Irma in 2017, and just last week we had a mere tropical storm which caused tremendous flooding throughout our great city. The holy city of Charleston, the original sea level rise strategy adopted in 2015, was aided by technical mapping assistance by the Regional Coastal Resilience Grant from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. The grant was awarded to the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium on behalf of the Charleston Resilience Network. I've worked with the Office of Coastal Resilience and have been out to the NOAA facility here in Charleston. I've seen the important work that NOAA and your office is doing with the digital coast mapping software, something it was very important to me as a state lawmaker, and even more important now as a member of Congress. Today, we're quickly learning that 5-year, 10-year, and further out flood plans are constantly evolving because this issue is rapidly changing, literally on a year-to-year basis. And I look forward to hearing from you on how the administration and your office plans to account for the budgeting needs of cities like Charleston, South Carolina, that are facing ever-growing, ever-changing flooding issues. I also want to add that, as I'm sure you know, the city of Charleston is working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers to propose seawall construction, in which engineers believe they can save the city from long-term impacts of storm surges until and through 2082. We're all eagerly awaiting the Corps' final report to be released and signed. We're hoping will be next month. I hope you'll be able to speak to your office's coordinating strategies also with the Army Corps of Engineers. Again, I appreciate your time today. I see your office and NOAA as critical for the needs of Charleston, of South Carolina, our first congressional district in the entire state of South Carolina. And I would like to invite you down here anytime to come and visit. So with the few moments that we have left on my time on the floor, I certainly would love to hear from you, Ms. LaBeouf, on NOAA and what we could do to help Charleston in our flooding situation here today.
Thank you, Congresswoman Mace. And Charleston is absolutely one of my favorite places in the country, and I share your concern about rising sea levels. In fact, later today, I will be speaking at a media event to release our high tide flooding report for this year. In my home state of Texas, for example, we either tied or broke several records from Galveston to Corpus Christi of more than 20 days of high tide flooding per year. Just 20 years ago, that was 2 to 3 days per year. And you're absolutely right. In Charleston, in Pensacola, we saw more than 14 days of high tide flooding, where just 20 years ago, it was 1 to 2 days. And so absolutely, we are facing some big challenges. And I really appreciate you bringing those up. We do work closely with the Army Corps of Engineers and advise them with regard to sea level rise and inundation risks and projections. We also work closely with the Army Corps on Engineering with Nature, which is a program that they lead to better understand the value of nature-based infrastructure to protect our coastlines and to provide critical habitat for commercially and recreationally viable species. With regard to this budget, we are very keen to make sure that we have the water level sensors in place, that we have high performance computing to be able to predict sea level rise and storm surge risks for all of our coastal communities. For the first time in human history, we must plan infrastructure for conditions that we've not yet seen. We've never had to do that before. And so it is essential that NOAA's predictive capabilities and our observations be put to the task and work with other federal agencies to make sure that our communities are safe and that our federal agencies are able to complete their missions with climate change in mind. So thank you so much. I will absolutely take you up on your offer to come to Charleston. It's been too long.
Thank you, Ms.
We
Mace.
would
Your
certainly
time
love
is
to have
up.
you. Thank you, Ms. Chairwoman.
You're very welcome. Next, we recognize Mr. Pappas. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and appreciate the comments of all of our panelists here today. And I want to focus my questions on the urgent need to address PFAS contamination, which is something that my constituents and all of the other members who are represented here today, their constituents are grappling with as well. Now, I've been encouraged and impressed by the commitment that the administration has taken on PFAS. I think we need aggressive, comprehensive action when it comes to making some forward progress here. It's about time. And Ms. Fox, maybe I could turn to you. I know that the administrator announced the creation of PFAS Council, and you've been appointed as co-chair. One of the charges of the council is to develop a multi-year strategy to address public health and environmental impacts from PFAS. So as we're approaching the first deadline of initial recommendations from the council, I'm wondering if you could share any updates on the work of this council. And in addition to that, what resources EPA may eventually need from Congress in order to move as quickly as possible when it comes to setting standards, holding polluters accountable, and protecting public health.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Pappas, and thank you for your incredible leadership on PFAS. It's quite inspiring, and I very much enjoyed having the opportunity to hear about your priorities for the people of New Hampshire. And you are right. I have the incredible honor of co-chairing the EPA's PFAS Council. And to preview for you some of the recommendations that we'll be making, we are really taking, again, a whole of EPA approach. Administrator Regan has directed us to think really creatively about how we harmonize all of our authorities under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, CERCLA within the Office of Land and Emergency Management, the Office of Air and Radiation. So we are taking that charge seriously. Some of the things that we're looking at are research, restrict, and remediate. We want to build the research and scientific base that we have at EPA and across the federal family. And we want to do that not only on individual PFAS, as we've historically done, but also how do we look at PFAS as a group? So how do we build that research and evidence base? And then second, we really want to restrict PFAS from entering our land, our air, and our water in the first place. You see what happens, Congressman, when we have that contamination in our communities. So one of the best things that we can do as a federal family is to restrict PFAS in the first place. So we're looking at that. And then finally, remediate. We have to tackle the PFAS contamination that exists in too many communities around the country. And so that's going to be also a huge priority of this EPA. As to your question around what we need, right now we are both looking at our current authorities, our current regulatory authorities, and how far we can go on tackling the PFAS contamination. But we may need to come back to you all for additional authority. Additionally, we need resources. We're grateful for the resources that we have, and we're trying to use every dollar wisely. But the scale of the problem in communities around the country is so great. And that's why I think we've been so pleased and just so inspired by your leadership on this issue. And really, truly believe this is an area where the executive branch and the legislative branch can make a lot of progress together.
Well, thanks for your comments. And it's an issue that many members are concerned about and working on. The ranking member also mentioned this issue in his opening statement, which I was pleased to hear. I've got legislation, the Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act, which would accelerate efforts to set limits on manufacturers who are still discharging PFAS into our waterways. So when we talk about restricting these forever chemicals from getting out into the environment, that's an important step forward. And in the few seconds that I have left, I'm wondering if you would agree that setting PFAS discharge standards for key polluters is a key pillar in curbing the PFAS crisis, and whether that fits within the framework envisioned by Congress when they authorized the Clean Water Act.
I agree with you, Representative. And one of the things that I'm proud of is that within the Office of Water, we have started to undertake a rulemaking that is looking at industrial discharges from PFAS manufacturers. So it is something that we intend to move forward with.
Cool. Thanks for that commitment. This work can't wait, and the health and well-being of our constituents and the environment as well depends on your work. So we will continue to engage on this, and I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pappas. The next order will be Ms. Gonzalez Colon, Mr. Stanton, Mr. Mast, and Mr. Carvajal. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, you may proceed. Ms. Gonzalez Colon is not answering. Mr. Mast, you're on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the time today. My remarks are going to Ms. Fox from the EPA. I've enjoyed speaking to you before, and I would just want to start by saying I really appreciate the work that you all have done on toxic algal blooms. Everybody on this committee knows this is the biggest thing that I work on because my community is getting poisoned by extremely toxic algal blooms on a regular basis. So just really want to thank you for the yeoman work that you all have done on ingestion standards. And to move a little bit onto that, EPA put out a policy or a standard that said toxic microcystin of the cyanotoxins over 8 parts per billion or 8 micrograms per liter is very toxic, could lead to Alzheimer's, ALS, liver failure, kidney failure, neurological things. Am I giving an accurate representation of your findings, ma'am?
Congressman Mast, it's wonderful to see you again. And again, I want to, really enjoyed visiting with you, and I want to thank you for your leadership on these issues. There are not many published studies on inhalation risks related to toxins produced by
This is
cyanobacteria.
ingestion, ma'am, ingestion. Going back to what you guys did on ingestion. I'm not asking about inhalation. Did I give an
Yes.
accurate representation of what you said about ingestion?
So we have examined the relative exposure levels between inhalation and incidental ingestion exposures based on available scientific studies. And what we determined from that analysis is that the amount of aerosolized microcysteines that people are expected to inhale is estimated to be much lower than the amount that is incidentally ingested while swimming.
Right. So if 8 micrograms per liter, somebody's swimming in that versus if somebody's breathing that, it's not as bad if they're breathing it versus if they're swimming and taking it in. That's fair to say.
I would love to check in with my team on this, Congressman, and get back to you because I do not want to misspeak.
You were quoted, not you, EPA was quoted by the Corps of Engineers to say the EPA indicates health risks associated with inhalation of these algal blooms is very low. Would you say that that's an accurate representation of what you all believe? You guys are being quoted as that.
Yes, Congressman, if that is the study, yes, I'm happy to follow up with you on this. I want to make sure that I'm getting the accurate information to you.
That's not a study. I actually asked the Corps for the source material. They didn't have it. So I'm asking you if they're interpreting, you guys said the Environmental Protection Agency indicates the highest risk from microcystin exposure is through ingestion. It's kind of like a duh thing. Anything, the highest risk is if you drink it and ingest it. But they extrapolated from that health risks associated with inhalation, therefore, are extremely low.
So, Congressman, as you know, there are hundreds of issues that the EPA Office of Water has responsibility for. And what you can always rely on and count on me is I'm only going to answer questions accurately when I have that information in front of me. So I am not deeply familiar with this particular study. So please let me check in with my career experts and I will get back to you promptly on this matter.
I will. I want to lead you a little bit more on it, though, just so you know what to check into. Like I said, they indicate that, or they actually said it's very low. I asked a very pointed question of the Corps because the fact of the matter is they're not just facing algal blooms measured at 8 parts per billion. They're facing algal blooms where they're directly, when I say directly on top of them, I mean directly on top of them for upwards of 10 hours a day at 800 parts per billion. Does that seem as though the individuals, the active duty military personnel and civilian Corps personnel that are exposed to that, does that seem like a healthy situation to you? That's an opinion question.
I'm sorry?
That's opinion question. Does that seem healthy to you?
Congressman?
Yes, ma'am. I hope that they'll pause the clock since Ms. Fox just went offline here until she's back on.
Somebody needs to get Dominique ASAP.
We can hear you.
Sorry, Congressman, I don't know what has happened, but we are getting our IT people immediately. But
Ms. Napolitano, if you want to pause and come back to me with my remaining time, I'd be open to that.
Well, you can hear her. You may not see her, but you can hear her.
Yes. Is this the camera? I don't know. What's that? Oh. Can you see me now?
I can hear her, but they're not really focused on me, Ms. Napolitano. Could we pause my time and come back when they're ready?
Well, I'd like to move on and then come back to you. Is that all right?
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it, ma'am. Thank you. I'll be standing by whenever you're ready to come back.
Very fine. So we have next is Mr. Stanton, followed by Mr. Carvajal and Mr. Delgado, and then Lowenthal. Mr. Stanton, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to ask questions of these outstanding witnesses. There is no area of our country where the need for significant investments in water infrastructure is more acute than in our tribal communities. Approximately 12% of tribal homes do not have safe water or basic sanitation facilities. And currently there is a backlog of more than 1,500 sanitation construction projects. As noted, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report infrastructure investment on tribal lands has been underfunded for decades. The chronic underinvestment has impacted not only the social, physical, and mental well-being of tribal members. It has affected the ability of tribes to fully leverage their economic potential. The COVID pandemic brought this underinvestment to light again, and no place was more evident than on the Navajo Nation in Arizona. More than 1/3 of the nation's population lacks access to running water or indoor plumbing, and many families have fewer than 10 gallons of water at home at any given time. The lack of access to water and basic sanitation helped fuel the spread of COVID on the nation, which in May of last year had the highest per capita infection rate in the entire country. Given the tremendous backlog of drinking water and sanitation projects across Indian country and on the Navajo Nation, where an estimated 700 million would be needed to connect everyone with safe drinking water and basic sanitation, the National Congress of American Indians has advocated for increasing the tribal set-aside in both clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. Administrator Fox, do you agree that increasing the set-aside would be one way to tackle the significant underinvestment in water infrastructure on our tribal communities?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Stanton. And yes, I agree with you on the tribal set-aside. I will say that this is an issue that I have had the opportunity to work on for a number of years. When the COVID-19 pandemic happened, I worked with a range of philanthropic partners and others to try to get more resources to the Navajo Nation. And this is a dire issue. It's also why President Biden has made one of the priorities of this administration to strengthen the nation-to-nation relationship with tribes. And just to preview something that's coming down the pike from the Office of Water, Congressman, is we are developing a tribal water action plan that is really the Office of Water and EPA's commitment to really accelerate action on these critical water issues in Indian country. And I really look forward to working with you on this moving forward.
Madam Chair, I'm hoping maybe in the future we could have a specific hearing on the issue of the water crisis on tribal nations across the country, and we can learn more detailed information from the EPA and the administration about what steps they are taking to better support our tribal nations. Sadly, the COVID crisis was significantly worse as a result of that water crisis. I now want to turn to the issue of our aging workforce. The Government Accountability Office projects that 30 to 50% of the municipal water workforce will be retiring over the next decade, taking with them decades of experience and knowledge. In my state, the Rural Water Association of Arizona has reported numerous vacancies, and communities and systems have been unable to fill positions due to a lack of qualified workforce. Water and wastewater utilities need a pipeline of qualified skilled workers to help ensure clean and safe water for the public and to maintain the infrastructure necessary to keep services for the public and to maintain the infrastructure necessary to keep service areas economically viable, especially in smaller rural communities. With 93% of the water systems in the country in communities of 10,000 or less, finding qualified workers is a significant challenge. How is the Office of Water addressing the shortage of qualified drinking water and wastewater operation professionals, especially in our smaller rural communities?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And this issue of an aging water workforce and the need to build the next generation of water workers is something that I saw firsthand when I worked for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. At that utility, we had essentially a third of our workforce eligible for retired. And what's particularly concerning to me about this issue is like the issue around COVID-19 that we just spoke about, that also the retirements are accelerating because of COVID-19. And so we were really so pleased that Congress has appropriated a couple of $1 million for a water workforce grant program to really invest in these types of workforce training programs. We're going to be announcing the first round of those grants soon. We have also done some work around technical assistance and those sorts of things. I agree with you that the work that National Rural Water, rural community assistance program does in helping again on these workforce issues. Very important, particularly in smaller communities and more rural areas. And Congressman, if this is an area where you would like to see the EPA doing more work, it's something I would welcome the opportunity to have a deeper strategy conversation with you on.
Thank you much. I yield back. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to Mr. Mast. You have 1 minute, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, Ms. Fox. Again, I appreciate that you'll be getting back to me with things. This is a very timely issue because I believe that our active duty service soldiers and core personnel are being poisoned as we speak, breathing in algal blooms 100 times greater than what you said are toxic. The EPA said are toxic, 800 parts per billion microcystin. Unequivocally, the EPA, or rather the Corps of Engineers, when I asked, are your people being poisoned? Soldiers. They said no. And they referenced because the EPA says health risks associated with inhalation at 8 parts per billion are low. Now, I'm talking about people standing on these things for 10 hours a day in a situation where you're gagging. It's so disgusting. And that's why this is an important opinion question right now. Do you feel that that's a safe situation for these people to be standing on 800 parts per billion, 10 hours a day? It's an important opinion question, ma'am.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question, and I apologize for the technical issues that happened. And I want to thank you, and I share your concerns for the people who are serving this country. In fact, my husband also served in the Army. And I think what I can just say is that my record on public health is clear. My commitment to you and understanding these issues better and reporting back, I'm publicly saying that now. I commit to following up with you on these specifics, and I will get.
I know you'll follow up, but does it seem safe to you?
You have your time is over, Mr. Mast.
Does it seem safe? Only hurting our soldiers here. That's unfortunate.
Next, we have Mr. Carvajal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to all the panelists and the witnesses that are with us today. Ms. LeBouf, our oceans are facing unprecedented challenges, from the warming waters to continued threats from oil drilling. It is clear we need to act to protect these valuable resources that are also drivers of our economies. One form of protection is through the National Marine Sanctuaries. Data from NOAA estimates that between 2010 and 2012, harvest from commercial fishing in the 4 existing California National Marine Sanctuaries generated $70 million in income and supported 1,840 coastal jobs. In my district, there is widespread support to protect the waters between the Monterey Bay and the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuaries as the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. The nomination for the Chumash Marine Sanctuary was formally accepted into the National Inventory in October 2015. I appreciate NOAA's support for extending the nomination last year after it expired. What is the expected time frame for NOAA to advance this nomination forward?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Carvajal. The National Marine Sanctuary System is really a jewel in the crown for conserving American waters and the resources that are there, and the economies that depend on them and related economies like fisheries. We are committed to considering the sanctuaries along our candidate list, and then we very much appreciate support being able to extend the deadline for the Chumash Sanctuary proposal. With regard to being able to address all of the sanctuary proposals on the inventory, that takes resources, and you will see in our FY22 budget that we have asked for increased resources to begin the process needed to really work forward on the proposal of the sanctuaries on the inventory, and that includes the Chumash proposal. It takes several steps to get us started. It also requires a lot of public input, which we are committed to taking throughout the process. So giving a timeline is difficult. But I can say with additional resources, we are eager to begin.
Well, thank you for that information. I can't stress the importance of this issue to my constituents. And my hope is as you look at prioritizing which goes next and which effort is given your time and energy, I sure hope that you give this sanctuary the next priority. Ms. LeBouf, I also want to discuss the importance of offshore wind. As you discuss in your testimony, offshore wind is rapidly developing throughout the United States. President Biden has set an ambitious goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in the United States by 2030. I am pleased to have worked with the administration and other stakeholders, including your department, to advance offshore wind off Morro Bay in my district. This will help create new jobs and allow us to move towards a more resilient future by investing in renewable energy. In promoting offshore wind, we also need to promote partnerships and co-use of our oceans. Fishermen need to be part of the planning process and are an important co-users of our oceans. Can you delve further on how NOAA intends to work with BOEM and stakeholders to achieve this goal?
Absolutely, and thank you again for that. I couldn't agree with you more that there are many very important users in the ocean already. It's a busy place. We just look at the surface of the water and think nothing's going on, but there are a lot of very important industries already in place, and making room for wind energy will be a challenge, but we are confident that we'll be able to work with fishermen and other industries to help reduce the potential conflicts between users. NOAA, for example, is very much involved in helping groups get together to plan and to inform early conversations about siting of offshore wind, so we can better understand, working from all the same information, what's underwater, what other industries are present, what the risks are, what the environmental conditions are, particularly as any new industry expands rapidly like we anticipate with wind. We will work closely with BOEM to make sure that the fishermen and other ocean users have a voice at the table, because their contributions are absolutely vital. And as always, NOAA will do that with a basis of science and informed decision support at the foundation.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, are you available now? I guess she is not. We're now in the closing end of it. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any and all questions that have may be submitted to you. Request unanimous consent that the record remain open 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. I would like to sincerely thank all our witnesses again for the testimony. And again, congratulations to Ms. Fox on your recent appointment. If no other members have anything to add, the committee does stand adjourned. Thank you. Goodbye.